And welcome back, everybody, to Hands on Apologetics. And like I said, the past affects what's going on right now. It shapes the world in which we know it. And therefore, it's important to know history, especially in defending the Catholic faith, because there's lots of distortions about Catholic history. And to help us look at one area of history that's very important in both categories is Stephen Weidenkopf. Stephen is a lecturer of church history at Christendom College Graduate School of Theology. He's the author of The Glories of the Crusades and The Real Story of Catholic History from Catholic Answers Press. And he also has a new book, which is called The Church in the Middle Ages, Cathedrals, Crusades, and the Papacy in Exile. And Steve Weidenkopf, welcome back to Hands on Apologetics.
Hey, Gary, how you doing? Thanks for having me on the show again.
Fascinating period in history. You know, the Avignon Papacy, the Great Schism. Maybe you could start us off on the roots. How did all this come about?
Yeah, sure. You know, it's a fascinating time period in church history, actually, Gary. You know, as you know, it's the 14th century, I think, is perhaps one of the most important foundational centuries for one of the most cataclysmic events that happens later on in church history, as we've talked about before, the Protestant Revolution / Reformation in the 16th century. But that didn't happen in a vacuum, right? That happened because certain things happened before it. And I think the critical century to understand what happens in the 16th century is that critical century is the 13th or the 14th century rather. And it's a century where just a lot of things happen. And it's a time period of just absolute crisis throughout all of Western Europe, not only from a church history perspective, but even more so from a secular history perspective, if you will. I mean, the century is full of just cataclysmic events and crises. There's a great famine that affects Europe, a series of crop failures where thousands of people are killed because of a lack of food. The 100 Years' War between France and England starts here in the 14th century and obviously carries into the 15th century. So you have warfare, you have famine, and then if that wasn't enough, in the middle of the 14th century, you have the great pestilence, as the contemporaries called it, or what we call it, the Black Death. So you have this far-reaching, horrible, horrific, catastrophic plague that kills nearly 50% on average Europe's population. So half the people in Europe are killed in the middle part of the century. And then, you know, so it's just, there's also peasant rebellions that happen as well in England and other places of Europe at this time too. So there's war, there's rebellion, there's famine, there's plagues. You know, and if that wasn't enough, then there's a crisis in the papacy as well, right, which really lays the foundation for the later Protestant Revolution. And that begins, as you mentioned, with the movement of the papal residency from Rome to Avignon. And that, again, didn't happen in a vacuum, but that happens because of some serious problems that are leading up into that century. In the 13th century, in the papacy at least, you had a series of short reigns, so popes who would only reign for a few years, followed by long conclaves. So it took this in the 13th century, it took the cardinals a very long time, years even, to elect a successor when a pope had died. This eventually leads in the 13th century to the whole locking the cardinals in one place in a conclave to elect a successor. Before that, before the 13th century, you didn't really have that. The cardinals would come, they'd meet for a bit, they'd leave. If they didn't elect a successor, they'd come back again. But in the 13th century, you have the practice finally of people in the church getting fed up with how long these conclaves took, and actually literally locking the cardinals in a palace and or wherever they were staying, and make them elect a successor. And even at one point, we find in the 13th century when that didn't work, even locking the cardinals in didn't work, didn't produce a quick enough result. The people actually of Viterbo at one point, where the cardinals were meeting, actually literally took the roof off of the building where the cardinals were staying so that they were exposed to the elements to get them to finally elect a successor. And even that, it took 3 days for the cardinals to do it. So, you know, just a lot of crisis going on here in the papacy. And it ultimately ends in the end of the 13th century, beginning of the 14th century, in the papacy of Boniface VIII. And Boniface VIII was, I think, he many times gets a bad rap, if you will, among various historians and others because of how abrasive he was as a person and his interactions with various secular rulers. But I think at heart, Boniface had, the church's well-being at the forefront of his mind, and he wanted to ensure that the papacy and the church as a whole was free from secular interference. And so he fought back against that, especially against the French king at the time, who was Philip IV the Fair. And Philip wanted to really control the church in France and be, not only autonomous in the secular world, but also, be in complete control or have absolute control in the ecclesial world as well, the church world. And so he wanted to control the church in France, and he and Boniface, really knocked heads together, if you will. And so when Boniface dies at the beginning of the 14th century, Philip IV is kind of done with being confrontational with the Pope. He wants a Pope that's going to do what he wants him to do and be very amiable to his designs. And so he's able to convince the College of Cardinals to elect a Frenchman who takes the name Clement V, to and in the hopes that this pope would be more conciliatory towards Philip. And he was. And one of the things Philip wanted Clement to do was to move the papal residency from Rome to the south of France, where the pope could be a little closer to the king of France. So that's kind of how this all begins and how the Avignon papacy starts, if you will.
Yeah. Now, if memory serves me correctly, wasn't the conclaves very small? So it was easy to manipulate? Was that true?
Exactly. Yeah, you're not talking about 120 some odd cardinals or something now. So at the most, it varied obviously, but you're talking anywhere from 30 to 50 cardinals or so, and way less than 50 in most times. So yeah, we're not dealing with large numbers of cardinals. So you're right. That does allow for manipulation. It does allow for, and this is what you do see in church history at this time is kind of the development of national blocks, if you will, right? So you have a group of French cardinals who, don't want Italian, and you have the Italians who don't want a French cardinal, and so neither group was necessarily large enough to totally dominate the college before you get to the Avignon papacy, and so that caused some of this conflict and these long delays because they just couldn't compromise and couldn't come up with a candidate that both kind of groups agreed to. But once the papacy moves its residence to Avignon, as we'll see through the 14th century, then those cardinals that are created are French more often than not 100%, but more often than not, the vast majority are French. So that by the time that period ends, when the Avignon papacy ends and the Pope moves back to Rome, you have an overwhelming number of French cardinals in the college, and that poses issues as well, as we'll see as we talk about the Great Western Schism here in a bit. Oh, sure.
Yeah. So now the papacy starts looking more like a French prince rather than the universal bishop.
Yeah, exactly, and that's one of the reasons why this move to Avignon was problematic for the church, right? Because many people can point to, and it's true, that popes previous to this century and previous to the Avignon papacy had lived outside of Rome for periods of time before in previous centuries, and that's true. They had they left for a multitude of different reasons and settled in their other areas or cities or whatever. Usually, it had to do because there was infighting among the leading Italian families, and that's one of the reasons why Clement V says in the early part of the 15th century why he's moving to Avignon is there's too much violence, too much fighting going on among the Italian nobles in Rome and the surrounding areas, and so it's just not safe for me, the Pope, to be there. So I'm going to move to the south of France. Now, I should have mentioned earlier, right, that the Avignon was actually papal territory. So the Pope, just to refresh, right, people who might be listening, the Pope at this time was not only a church ruler, right, but also an ecclesial ruler, but also was a secular ruler. He actually did hold vast amounts of secular land and territories of which he was the political ruler of. And one of those areas and territories was Avignon, the south of France. So he is moving from kind of one papal area, if you will, to another papal territory. But, as you rightly point out, right, he is the Bishop of Rome, and not living in the Diocese of Rome, he's then committing the ecclesiastical abuse known as absenteeism, where a bishop doesn't reside in his own diocese. So that's a problem. That had been a problem in church history previous to these centuries with bishops, not necessarily with the Bishop of Rome, but other bishops. But now, since the papacy is involved in this ecclesial abuse, there's really no high ground for the Pope, if you will, to get rid of this abuse, right? The Pope at this time, who's living in the south of France, can't say to let's say the bishop of a diocese in the German territories, well, you're not living in Cologne, you're off in Paris, but you're the Archbishop of Cologne. You need to go live in Cologne. The Archbishop of Cologne could say, well, I like Paris. It's a nicer city than Cologne, and you're not living in Rome, and you're the Bishop of Rome, so why would I have to move? So it causes, scandal, obviously, and problems in church governance. But also, as you indicated, right, it does point to problems secularly. Other rulers, secular rulers of Europe, looked at the popes in the south of France and thought they were nothing more than puppets of the French king. You have the ear of the French king. You're living surrounded by French territory. You move there at the behest of the French king. So obviously, the popes are nothing more than just a puppet. And history does show that the popes who lived in Avignon for nearly 70 years were anything but puppets of the French king. They didn't just do what he wanted. They did, continue to rule independently and fight, push back on certain policies of his that they didn't agree with, and didn't see themselves as just kind of vassals, or if you will, or puppets of the French king. But the perception across Europe and across Christendom was very much that was the case, right? So if you're the king of England and you're engaged in warfare with France, and you had been since, for a while now, several decades by the time the popes move, you're concerned, right, about why should you listen to the Pope if he's seemingly backing the French king, or if you think he's going to back the French king because he's more apt to be controlled or more apt to be influenced by French royal policy. So that's problematic for Europe, for Christendom as a whole, and that's why the Avignon papacy is a significant scandal in church history, not just from the ecclesial abuse, but because it begins to weaken, respect from other secular rulers towards the papacy. And that really comes into play as we get into the 16th century and the Protestant Revolution. That really kind of fans the flame of secular rulers seeing an opportunity to dislodge themselves from any kind of adherence or loyalty to the Pope.